In the long term, women risk of mortality after heart attack compared to men. And then if we take that first statistic out, a study found that 5 years after first heart attack, 47% of women die compared to 36% of men. Again, our mortality is worse in the first year. It's worse exactly when it happens. It's worse in 5 years compared to men. And this is all after menopause. Women are also more likely to develop heart failure after a heart attack. So within 5 years of a heart attack, we get heart failure within immediately, and 46% are likely to develop heart failure compared to 22% of men. Have you been feeling off? You know what? Your hormones might be out of whack. Take my quiz to discover your personalized hormone imbalance and get a free report with your results. Learn what's really going on with your hormones and start feeling like yourself again. Just visit the website quiz.hormoneshelp.com to take the hormone quiz now. What if I were to tell you that breast cancer is not even close to the biggest risk women face in the aging process? It's actually cardiovascular disease. So in today's wonderful Menopause Mastery podcast, we are going to go deep dive into a part of the concerns around cardiovascular disease, specifically how women's hormones and how we have unique risks and also benefits because we're female for cardiovascular disease. And this includes heart attack and stroke and what you can do about it. This is all in honor of this month being Women's Heart Health Month. So as promised, I'm going to talk all about a very unknown but very important part of your vascular system that is very much affected by our hormones. And when you can really harness this part of the vascular system and really support it, it has great far-reaching effects. Now, before I get into that, I really want to talk about why this is important to me. So first off, if you've ever listened to my show before, you know that, or if you've heard my story, part of my story is that my father had his first heart attack when I was 6 years old. We were actually camping in this crappy campground in rural New Jersey. And we had one of those, if you remember this, if you're probably of my age, you remember the pop-up tents that you could drag behind your car that sort of popped out on each side and had the tent on top and it sort of closed up almost like a lunchbox. Well, we had one of those. And my brother and I were helping my dad actually flip that out and get it opened on a Friday night after we drove like a bat out of hell to get to the campground and have our fabulous, weekend vacation time as a family. And my dad started complaining of tight chest feelings and a bunch of other things. Most of it is kind of a blur to me because I was such a young kid. But that was my first experience in a hospital. And, watching my dad, he was 42 years old and he had a massive coronary. And so, I've always had that sort of in the back of my mind. Well, if you've also heard my story, I'm adopted. So I thought, that doesn't really mean much to me. That's my dad's genetic history, not my genetic history. I probably don't need to really worry about that. But I got a little bit older, and there's a couple of different things that became very important to me. So first off, when I was in my 20s, early 20s, I started developing varicose veins. And I'm not talking about the little spider veins that show just a little bit, and they're kind of unsightly, and we don't like the way they look. I'm talking full-blown bulging veins. Now, at the time, I was working for a retail company. I had been, doing that through college and even in high school. And so I spent a lot of time standing on my feet. And I thought, that's what this is really about. So I ended up having one of those veins lasered shut in my mid-20s, right? And, I go forward in my life, continue to go on. I continue to develop some varicose veins. I've since had, multiple, vein ablations and other actual activities to try and reduce the risk of cardiovascular and particularly what they call peripheral vascular disease, which is all part of the cardiovascular risk profile. Now, flash forward to 2 years ago, I had a pre-nuvo scan. And in the pre-nuvo scan, this is a full-body MRI with AI technology. It's the most definitive and the most advanced full-body MRI that you can get. There's only a few in the country. We happen to be lucky enough to have them in Dallas, and most of our clients and patients get it done. Well, I remember meeting with a radiologist, and he's looking at my brain because they scan the brain, and he says, I see a little bit of ischemic area in the brain on both sides. It's unilateral, so it's on each side, but we would expect that in a woman of 62 years old. So I stopped him for a moment because he couldn't see me. We were speaking verbally, but we weren't on any kind of Zoom where he could see me. And I said, well, that's interesting because I'm only at the time 52. And what that means is ischemic means that there's an area that has lost some blood supply, right? It was small, but it was visible, right? It was visible on an MRI, which MRI of the brain is not really easy. So, that really started me really doubling down on cardiovascular health. And since then, I had a carotid artery screen looking at the tissues in the carotid arteries. And even there was a little bit of plaque buildup there. And I thought, oh my gosh, and I've been in this industry. I've been in the functional medicine, clinical nutrition industry for 20 years. I eat clean. I exercise. I take my fish oil. I do vitamin D. I do all the things that I am supposed to do to be healthy. What I found also was that I had a lot of genetic risk for cardiovascular problems. Obviously, that was showing up very early in my life. Just looking at my vascular problems, my varicose veins early on. So what I'm going to share with you today, this is important, right? And this is something that I find in a lot of women, because here's the reality, is cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer of women. Women are more likely to die early. Women are more likely to experience stroke and heart attack and die from than men, right? And we're going to talk about the structure in the blood vessel, how estrogen and progesterone are protective to that, and what you can do about it so you reduce these risks. Because God knows we are in this time period of life, we want to have a really great life. So today we're going to talk about a thing called the endothelial glycocalyx. So we're going to have a spelling test later on about this, and we're all going to have to try and spell this. So no, we aren't, I promise. So the endothelial glycocalyx is this structure that lines the inner surface of blood vessels. And it's really critical in maintaining your vascular health. It's composed of layers of these things called proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and that coat the cells. And they've performed several functions. So the first thing, it acts as a barrier regulating the passage of molecules between the blood and the vessel wall. So think of it, we talk about leaky gut. It is going to keep your veins from being, and blood vessels from being leaky. And so it maintains that integrity, and it prevents excessive leakage of fluids and proteins into the interstitial space. So that's the space beyond the blood vessels, which causes a lot of inflammation and lots of other problems. And it also senses and transmits a mechanical force, such as shear stress, to the endothelial cells. This is crucial to maintain vascular tone and blood flow. So if you've heard me talk about my genetics, I happen to carry a 9p21 gene that has an extraordinary risk. I carry 6 copies of it that has a significant risk for shear force injury to the blood vessel. So think of this as an inner tube to your bicycle. And if I have shear force, I had this happen on Saturday this week. I had shear force on my tube in my bicycle tire, so I blew a flat, right? So I blew the tube. Right? So I don't want that to happen to my blood vessels. So the endothelial glycocalyx actually maintains normal blood flow regulation and protects that shear force. It's also protectant against coagulation, which is clumping or clotting, and inflammation. So it has this anticoagulant activities, and it prevents leukocytes and platelets, which are the things that can cause clots, from adhering to the blood vessel walls. Right? So this reduces our risk of inflammation and a thing called thrombosis, which is basically a clot, right? A clot in a blood vessel, which we don't want. And it plays a very significant role in insufficiency or sufficiency of venous activity in varicose veins. So think of it this way. The reason why this is important is the glycocalyx is almost like seaweed in an ocean. And it swings back and forth, and it lines, just like seaweed lines the ocean floor, this lines our blood vessel floor, and it protects the blood vessels from damage. So just like a seaweed does. So if you go into an ocean and it has no seaweed near the coral reef, it's not a very healthy coral reef. All right, so let's talk about how this plays a role in the different cardiovascular events, right? So cardiovascular events can be TIAs, which are minor strokes, and we have things like venous insufficiency, which can lead to a form of dementia if it's in the brain, but it can also lead to peripheral vascular disease and many other problems. So in the context of things like venous insufficiency, because I definitely from a cardiovascular standpoint, this is also a big player in your forms of dementia. So when that happens, right? So we have valves in our blood vessels, our veins, that prevent blood flow back in the veins. So Imagine you're moving blood up from the bottom of your legs, from your feet, and it's got to move all the way to the heart. Every time your heart beats, the little doors in the blood vessels in your veins at every particular interval close so the blood doesn't just go all the way back down. So when we have damage to the endothelial glycocalyx, this can contribute to the valve dysfunction and lead to more venous insufficiency, which causes blood pooling, the unsightly little spider veins, and then bulging. Like I said, it's going to lead to inflammation, and that chronic inflammation can weaken the vein wall and contribute to varicose veins. And if I get leukocytes binding, which are an immune cell, binding to the surface, it can trigger more inflammatory activity, which means we get more plaquing, which means we get a greater risk for cardiovascular event. And then, even more important, it is protective, the glycocalyx, against venous hypertension, which is common when you have venous insufficiency. And this can cause damage to the endothelium when it's not controlled, and it can cause more shear force stress. So if we look at it, we've got the cardiovascular disease sort of, continuum, which we've got atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes, and then all of the end result diseases, venous insufficiency, deep vein thrombosis, stroke, heart attack, TIA, and dementia, right? Now, what's really interesting is women, when we're premenopausal, have a thicker, more stable endothelial glycocalyx than men. And this difference may contribute to the lower risk of cardiovascular disease that we see in perimenopausal women. So we are protected until menopause. And then after menopause, this protective effect goes away. And this has really been thought, and I would say at this point, it's without question that it's the decline in estrogen levels that are contributing to it. And so menopause obviously has been associated with just about every negative side effect that you can imagine that you guys may be experiencing. But on top of this, decrease in estrogen, the change in our sex hormones leads to thinning and shedding of the endothelial glycocalyx and may increase that risk of cardiovascular disease. All right, so we've kind of painted the picture. This is why this is so important to you. Now, the other thing that the endothelial glycocalyx does is it helps us make nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is a crucial molecule for the health of your blood vessels. It's produced by the actual glycocalyx swinging back and forth like fancy seaweed. And it helps maintain sort of homeostasis, everything being balanced. And nitric oxide is a vasodilator, right? So I want my blood vessels to be wide and move fluid and blood back and forth very easily. And so nitric oxide helps regulate blood flow and pressure. It relaxes the smooth muscles in the blood vessels. And it has anti-inflammatory, antiplatelet, and anti-proliferative properties. So it is vital to be able to produce the most nitric oxide that we can. And like I said, glycocalyx serves as this mechanosensor as it swings back and forth to the heartbeat, just like seaweed, and it helps signal the endothelial cells to produce more nitric oxide. So if I have my estrogen and my glycocalyx is nice and healthy and it's swinging back and forth like fancy seaweed, it's going to produce more nitric oxide, which is going to allow blood flow further down the blood vessels and bring oxygen and supply and also reduce inflammation. And again, when it releases nitric oxide and we have an intact glycocalyx, it keeps the blood vessel from being leaky, right? So now, like I said, we see significant changes in nitric oxide also when we go through menopause. So we do see sex differences. And again, I'm speaking of sex differences, talking about biological sex, which can be fluid based on how we see ourselves in the world. But sex differences in nitric oxide, again, premenopausal women have higher levels of nitric oxide when we compare them to age-matched men. And again, we tend to see cardiovascular activity and damage in women about a decade behind men, and it is because of this hormone effect that we see. What is the importance of all of this? And then what can you do, right? So we're going to go through the very basics of now, okay, I've got this glycocalyx. I want to protect it. I know that I'm at risk if I'm perimenopause or menopausal, and I want to know the right way to do it, right? So let's talk about the basics first. Diet. Foods that are high in polyphenols, right? Foods that are high in your antioxidants are going to feed the glycocalyx, and they're going to help your antioxidant capacity. So this includes fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Chocolate is an antioxidant if you guys are big into chocolate, or in my case, coffee, beans. right? I want to have a diet rich in antioxidants and rich in polyphenols because they are protective. That's where the discussion for like resveratrol, even curcumin is a high polyphenolic food. Here, let me just give it down to you. You can't drink possibly enough wine to give you the antioxidant capacity that you need. So, up to 4 ounces might be okay, but you can't really just down a bunch of resveratrol and see improvement here. What you want is a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole foods, and think about it as a rainbow of color, right? If I eat something purple, something red, something orange, something blue, something green, something yellow, every day, I eat a little bit of those variety in vegetable forms, not Skittles, right? In vegetable and fruit forms, nuts and seeds, right? I'm going to get all of the phytonutrients in a package that my body anticipates and expects to receive. So first off, the diet has a lot to do with this. So I want to make sure that I'm getting it. So for me, especially in the summertime and spring, which lasts 6 to 8 months, at least in Texas, I try and get in a salad with a bunch of these things on it because I can get a lot of nutrient density in a very easy to take form. Now, some of your antioxidant powders and things like that can help, but they don't necessarily make up for the other value that we get in those polyphenols when we eat them in foods with fiber. We actually feed our microbiome, which is also very beneficial for your health, right? And hormone balance and cardiovascular health. So if I eat real food, I'm going to get all the right nutrients at the real time. But I can also use things like mixed greens and red powders. And definitely, if I'm doing a protein shakes, those things can also help. Right. So I want to make sure I get that. I also want to make sure that I'm taking my basic nutrients. I don't make a lot of nutrient recommendations because on this show, I make a few here and some very targeted ones, but there's some basics that everybody needs, right? We should be taking vitamin D every day or exposing ourselves over time so we don't burn to adequate, appropriate sun exposure without sunscreen on and with our blocking glasses off. So you want to do that early in the morning and then early mid-morning if you can get out again. I don't really get a chance to do that during the week. So I try and get some early sun exposure because not only does it help set my circadian rhythm, but if I have a lot of skin exposure, it helps me synthesize vitamin D. That's not the only thing that sun exposure does, but it is one of the more important things. I also support with vitamin D supplementation because vitamin D is really a hormone in the body. Every single cell has a receptor for it, and it is beneficial to our health. So you want to have adequate and appropriate vitamin D levels. Those, just hands down, we need that. Now, your omega-3s, right? Your EPA and DHA, specifically derived usually from fish oil. You can get it from algae, but you have to down a ton of algae to do it. You can get alpha-linolenic acid from flax, but then it has to get converted to EPA, which not everybody is good at. So I generally, unless somebody's super allergic to krill and or fish, I use fish oil. And the general rule of thumb is that we probably need about 2,000 milligrams a day, sometimes more, a lot of times right in that range. A whole ton is not always better, right? We want to make sure that we're taking adequate, not too much, but we're also not getting too little because your body cannot synthesize or make omega-3s, so you must get them from your diet. And it has kind of a U-shaped curve. If you look at the studies, there's an adequacy curve that optimizes and then it starts to reverse back on itself, where if you start taking really large amounts, it throws off the other omega balances and becomes basically counterproductive. So fish oils, I think, are absolutely required. Now, in most cases, I'm just going to be really honest, most people need a little bit of magnesium. Supplementally, often at night, can help with sleep. It's so rare for me to see somebody that we test nutrient levels on, particularly intracellular magnesium, and see adequate. Serum markers are okay, red blood cell markers are okay, but that's 7 or 21% of the total body available magnesium, which isn't really adequate to say, are you at optimal ranges? So most people are going to be somewhere between 300 and 600 milligrams of magnesium a day. And then there's a wide variety of things once I know somebody's history or once my team knows somebody's history. So if I eat the vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, and I also get vitamin D and omega-3s, so I've now supplemented some of the very important things that my body needs, probably some additional magnesium. I want lean proteins, healthy fats, right? So lean proteins can be your fish, can be your chicken, it can be eggs. I don't do eggs personally. I'm allergic to them or sensitive to them, I should say. But it's also a great food source. And then lean cuts of red meat, things like buffalo and bison are really, really good. Cow or beef is also really good. And then when I look at healthy fats, I'm going to lean in towards your monounsaturated fats like olive oil, then healthy things like your avocado oil. When we look at the data, I just have to break it to you, when you look at the data for cardiovascular disease, when we look at clinical trials where they controlled actual intake of saturated fats like animal fats and or things like your monounsaturated fats like olive oil, we saw protective effects with the olive oil that by far exceeded the value of what we saw with saturated fats. I know that's a big argument today online, but to be honest, I'm going to look at the clinical trials and say, hey, we probably need more of the Mediterranean diet types of fats. Right? So if I do those things, I'm now feeding my body and my microbiome some of the very important nutrients that we see. Now, if I'm doing starchy stuff, my preference is to do things like legumes and your starchy vegetables. And if I'm doing whole grains, I'm going to do them in their natural form. We don't see pasta or toast growing on the side of the road. Those are not whole grains. They are modified foods, processed foods made from whole grains. So if you do those, then you want to do the whole version as much as you can. I'm gluten-free, so I happen to not eat gluten, but I might eat brown rice or quinoa from time to time. Those are also great because they provide nutrients in itself, and they also provide fiber for your microbiome. Now, let's talk about how to protect the endothelial glycocalyx. So we talked the basics, the food. Now, exercise. To protect the glycocalyx, right? We need to have a healthy heart. So it means we need to have some cardiovascular fitness. Right now, depending on your genetics, now you may or may not know yours, you may be better suited for weight training and burst training type activity, which is a short duration activity that has small increases in effort, right? Sort of like interval training, but think of that as shorter and faster and harder. And you may also have a combination genetic profile where you can do some endurance activity. Now, you could be me, where I've got 6 copies of the 9P21, and I should not be doing endurance cardio at a heart rate in zone 3 or above for any extended period of time. And this is a more loaded question. I've talked about it before in other podcasts, but what that means is when I do cardio, I'm trying to be in what they call a zone 2 zone, which for me is about 124 to 137 heart rate over a sustained period of time, which means my body is still in a fat-burning zone. It keeps the overall oxidative stress lower, which protects my blood vessel from shear force, right? If I'm up in the zone 4 and I'm riding or running as hard as I can for an hour, I'm going to be in a situation where I'm going to increase oxidative stress because I'm breathing really hard, quite literally, and I'm going to cause more shear force potential on my blood vessels. Now, it doesn't mean I don't do anything at all, because I also want to make sure that I maintain a really awesome VO2 max. And VO2 max is the absolute top end of how hard your heart can beat, how fast you can go, how hard you can go for how long, to tell us what your overall heart rate variability and recovery is. And I actually have a very high VO2 max for my age group compared to age-controlled individuals. And so I do cardio, but I don't do it 5 times a week. I do it once. I do it for an hour to 2 hours at a minimum. I don't do 20 minutes because I'm not going to get a lot of benefit out of that. If I've only got 20 minutes, I'd rather do burst training. And then I weight train on the other days that I do work out. Now, the reason why this is important is if you carry greater vascular risk, and maybe you don't know genetics, but look at your family, look at your other individuals in your life. If you've got greater risk and you can kind of look at the family members, this is a way to start sort of mapping out what you should be doing. So an hour or 45 minutes in a high intensity interval environment, like in, let's say, Orange Theory, I don't mean to throw them under the bus, but their intensity is hard, right? That's too long. Right? I would not do that 3 or 4 times a week. I mean, I love doing that kind of stuff. I just know that as I get older, I need to work out smart and intentional about giving me the best benefit, not necessarily feeding my ego, which really loves to do stuff at intensity. So if you're somebody that hits that kind of cardiovascular risk and you think this is you, then I would really look at what are you doing physically and sort of remap it. The hard part with zone 2 is it doesn't feel like you're doing enough, right? In most cases, if you've done running or if you've done, like I did triathlons, if I'm in zone 2, it doesn't feel like I'm working hard enough. And I always kind of want to push it, but it's like one step back from that. You're struggling to talk, but you can still talk, right? So the exercise, and then I weight train, right? So don't forget the weight training, right? The other sign of longevity in health and longest lifespan is grip strength and overall quadriceps strength repeatedly over and over again. It's not because your hands can grip well. It's because that implies that you can lift heavy stuff and do it again and again, right? So I want to weight train. All right, so we covered food, we covered exercise, protect sleep. I'm not going to belabor sleep today, but protect your sleep because that's when the body recovers. And then I'm going to talk about 2 very important products. One is called Artrosulfur HP, and it's made by a company called Calroy Labs. And I happen to love this company. I know the upper management of this company, and I have followed their research for quite a while. Now, what Calroy did is they actually created a glycocalyx on a small microchip. So they actually grew some fancy seaweed from your blood vessels because this stuff isn't even visible without a really high-powered microscope. All right, so they created one. And then through a series of studies, figured out exactly what helped grow it back and protect it. And so Artrosulfur HP is the ingredients that helps restore glycocalyx function and restore that balance, right? And so they've done some small clinical trials that actually showed improvement in the blood vessel. I've been taking it personally. This is my personal experience. It doesn't mean it would happen to anybody. But when I got the Delta variant, I had been taking Artrosulfur for over a year. Yeah, it was probably right at a year. And I got Delta, and it was just as bad as everybody thought it was. But within 2 weeks, I had recovered from Delta, and I rode 30 miles on day 15 of having been diagnosed with the Delta variant. And so for me, I really honestly believe it was Artrosulfur HP and my antioxidants that I was taking that really helped me, right? So Artrosulfur, you take one in the morning and one at night at dinner, so breakfast and dinner, and it just helps restore it. It actually works better when you give it with food. And so I just consider that one of those things that if you carry cardiovascular risk, it is a slam dunk, you should use it. And then the other product, which is a little bit newer, is a product called Vascanox HP by Calroy. And I get nothing for this. I'm going to put a link in the show notes so you can go look at it. I'm not getting any affiliation value out of this at all. I just think these products are game changers, and I wanted to share it because, again, statistically, women are kind of SOL when it comes to cardiovascular health and longevity. But what Vascanox really does is Vascanox helps increase nitric oxide for a longer period of time. There are a lot of products out there that actually help you raise nitric oxide. The problem is they don't always show that it's going to help for a serious length of time. I love Vascanox HP. It's 2 capsules a day, and I tend to take it in the morning between my thyroid and the first time I eat and drink, after I've given my thyroid enough time to work. So these 2 are like a 1-2 punch to help improve blood vessel control and blood vessel protection and keep it from being leaky and help it move your blood back and forth and keep everything kind of wide open so you get a lot of blood flow. And they are absolutely fabulous. So if you're interested in looking at it, check out the show notes and they're absolutely there. Or you can look up Artrosulfur and Vascanox and Calroy, and that's Calroy Labs. Now, here's the final take home, right? So I just want to help you kind of solidify this. And this is why I'm so interested in cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular event of some sort is the leading cause of death for women in the United States. And it accounts for, and we're talking against every other disease state, 1 in 5 female deaths. Women are more likely to die from a heart attack than a man. So our first time is more deadly. And in the first year after a heart attack, 26% of women die when only 19% of men do. Women have a higher lifetime risk of stroke, and about 1 in 5 women will have a stroke compared to 1 in 6 men. Women are more likely to experience, this is what really makes me angry, because I always get frustrated at medicine. We're more likely to experience delays in emergency treatment. We're less likely to receive aggressive treatments, things like, stenting or, even going and doing more extensive looking because we don't present the same way as men. We're less likely to receive guideline recommendations, medications, or even invasive procedures to go protect and correct the problem. In the long term, women risk of mortality after heart attack compared to men. And then if we take that first statistic out, a study found that 5 years after first heart attack, 47% of women die compared to 36% of men. Again, our mortality is worse in the first year. It's worse exactly when it happens, and it's worse in 5 years compared to men. And this is all after menopause. Women are also more likely to develop heart failure after a heart attack. So within 5 years of a heart attack, we get heart failure within immediately, and 46% are likely to develop heart failure compared to 22% of men, right? So at more than double the rate. And we have a higher lifetime risk of developing vascular dementia compared to men. And again, this is because we have a slightly greater longevity than men, but vascular dementia and vascular concerns develop long before those last few years that we tend to outlive men. And so the big take-home message here is if I can protect the endothelial glycocalyx, your fancy blood vessel seaweed, that's how you can remember it, and increase nitric oxide, that's the stuff that helps your blood vessels get nice and wide, I'm going to have an improved cardiovascular health. And then last but not least, if I also enter into the perimenopause to menopause transition and support estrogen, I'm going to see an improvement in my overall risk patterns here because estrogen is actually protective to the endothelial glycocalyx. And if you look at progesterone also relaxes the smooth muscles in the body. So it can have a positive effect even on things like tension in the blood vessels. So I may also look at hormone replacement. I would say I don't take any of it off the table for any woman, but it is also protective for this long-term risk. So hope you are understanding the extra value that protecting your blood vessels has for women and the activities you can take to protect yourself. All right. Thank you for joining me on Menopause Mastery. If you love this episode, hit the subscribe button. I'd love to have you subscribe, and I'll be back next week. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.